He once shouted that their child would ruin his life. 4 years later, he saw the little girl, and realized she had saved it. Michael Hale had built his entire life on control. Every meeting, every contract, every calculated risk in the boardroom was measured, precise, and designed to secure his dominance in a world where weakness meant destruction. Yet on the night everything unraveled, control slipped from his grasp in the quiet of his own home. The city skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors, but Michael's focus was fixed entirely on the woman standing in front of him. Sarah stood with trembling hands pressed protectively against her stomach, her brown eyes wide with both fear and defiance. The air between them was thick with words unsaid, with choices neither could take back. He could not believe what she had just told him. "You'll ruin my life with this child," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly against the walls. His dark hair fell forward as he moved, pacing with restless energy, his blue eyes flashing like shards of ice. He had faced hostile boardrooms and ruthless rivals with more composure than he now showed to the woman who had once been his refuge. Fear disguised itself as fury as he hurled accusations, telling her she had trapped him, that he had worked too hard to have it all torn apart by something he had not planned. In his mind, children were chains, anchors that would drag him away from the empire he had fought to build. Sarah did not flinch, though tears glimmered in her eyes. She lifted her chin, her brown hair falling over her shoulders, and her voice was steady even as it trembled around the edges. "This is not the end of your life, Michael. This is the beginning of another. You can choose to run from it, or you can choose to be part of it." Her words were soft, but they carried weight, a quiet strength that made his anger falter for just a second. Yet pride and fear rose stronger, drowning out reason. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze, unwilling to face the possibility that she might be right. The silence stretched, suffocating and cold. Outside, the world glittered with winter lights, but inside the room, there was only darkness between them. Sarah's heart pounded as she waited for him to speak again, for any sign that he would step forward instead of pulling away. When he finally did turn, his expression was one she would never forget, harsh, closed, a man who had chosen power over love. His words were clipped and final, slicing through the air with devastating precision. "I will not let this destroy everything I've built. If you keep it, you do it without me." Her breath caught, the ground shifting beneath her as if the foundation of her life had been pulled away. She wanted to scream, to make him see the truth that burned so brightly inside her, that this child was not ruin but redemption, a chance for something real. Instead, she only whispered, "Then I will do it without you." Her voice broke at the end, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. She would not let him see her fall apart. Michael's jaw tightened, and without another word he turned and walked toward the door. The sound of it slamming shut was final, reverberating through the walls and through Sarah's heart. She sank to the floor, her hands covering her face as tears finally spilled freely. In the silence that followed, only the faint hum of the city below remained, mocking the emptiness he had left behind. That night, Sarah lay awake in the vast, cold bed that had once felt like home, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. The child inside her shifted, a small flutter that reminded her she was no longer alone. Though her body trembled with fear, a spark of determination grew quietly in her chest. He might have chosen power over them, but she would choose love. She would fight, even if it meant fighting alone. Michael, in his separate world of glass towers and hollow victories, poured himself a drink and stared out at the skyline he had conquered. For the first time, the lights felt dim, their brilliance dulled by the echo of Sarah's words and the vision of her standing unyielding before him. He tried to bury the unease with liquor and promises that he had done the right thing, that he had protected his empire. But as the night wore on, and the silence grew louder, he could not shake the image of her eyes, eyes filled not with defeat, but with strength he did not understand. Neither of them slept. Neither of them knew that this night, this moment of fracture, would define everything that came after. Sarah's world collapsed quietly, without the spectacle of destruction, but with the slow grinding weight of reality pressing against her shoulders. The weeks after Michael's departure blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, fear, and the relentless ache of abandonment. The apartment that once felt too small for the two of them now seemed unbearably large, filled with shadows that clung to every corner. At night she lay awake, listening to the silence that had replaced his voice, her hand resting protectively against her growing stomach as if to remind herself she was not truly alone. Yet even in her moments of despair, the child within her became a beacon, a fragile reminder that love was still possible even if the man she had loved had turned his back on it. She tried to hold on to her pride, telling herself she didn't need Michael, that she had survived before him and she could survive without him again. But surviving while carrying a child was different. Simple tasks became monumental struggles. The nausea in the morning stole her strength, the long shifts she worked at a local diner left her legs aching, and the stares from strangers burned whenever she had to explain that there was no father waiting at home. She fought to keep her composure, but sometimes she cried quietly in the bathroom at work, muffling the sound with her hands, because she couldn't let the world see how broken she felt. Her family lived far away, and pride kept her from calling them to confess what had happened. She told herself she had to do this alone, that this was her burden and her responsibility. When the first doctor's appointment arrived, she sat in the waiting room with her coat wrapped tightly around her, watching couples enter together, men holding their partners' hands, eyes full of nervous anticipation. She sat alone, pretending to read an outdated magazine, forcing herself not to compare her life to theirs. When the doctor placed the ultrasound wand against her belly and the first rapid thrum of a heartbeat filled the room, Sarah broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stared at the flickering image on the screen. That sound, that life, was proof that she had been right. This was not a mistake, not a curse, not the end of her world. This was a beginning, even if it came wrapped in loneliness. As her pregnancy advanced, the challenges grew sharper. Rent was a constant battle. Her boss at the diner grew less sympathetic when her energy waned, and more than once she came close to losing her job. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced, and she feared what would happen when she could no longer work. Still, she pushed forward, one exhausting day at a time. She began sewing small clothes by hand, using scraps of fabric from thrift stores, pouring her love into every imperfect stitch. At night she whispered to her unborn child, promising that no matter what happened, they would be safe and loved. Months slipped by until the day finally came. Labor was long and difficult, the kind of pain Sarah thought might break her in half, but she clung to the thought of the tiny life she was about to meet. When the cries of her daughter filled the sterile hospital room, Sarah's heart burst open. The nurse placed the baby in her arms, a tiny bundle with dark hair plastered to her head and startling blue eyes that blinked up at her as if she already knew her mother's soul. Sarah named her Lily, the name she had whispered to herself in lonely nights, the name that represented hope and renewal. Holding Lily for the first time, Sarah felt both stronger and more fragile than she had ever been. She was exhausted, broke, and more alone than ever, but she had something that money could not buy and that Michael had been too blind to see. She had love, pure and unshakable. In that moment she vowed that Lily would never feel unwanted, never doubt that she was cherished. The days after Lily's birth were some of the hardest of Sarah's life. The sleepless nights blurred into endless cycles of feeding, rocking, and soothing, while her body struggled to heal. Bills piled up, and the loneliness pressed harder than ever. Yet every time Lily's tiny fingers curled around hers, Sarah found strength she didn't know she possessed. She began to measure her life not in the losses she had endured, but in the small victories: the first time Lily smiled, the nights when she slept for 3 hours in a row, the mornings when she woke to find her daughter watching her with wide, trusting eyes. Michael never called. He never wrote. His world continued without them, and Sarah knew she could not waste her life waiting for him to realize what he had thrown away. The pain of his absence still lingered, sharp and unrelenting, but slowly it transformed into something else. It became fuel, a fire inside her that pushed her to keep going, to work harder, to build a life for Lily that was full of warmth even if it lacked wealth. By the time Lily was a year old, Sarah had become someone new. She was no longer the woman who had begged Michael to see their child as a gift. She was a mother, a fighter, a survivor. Her scars were invisible, but they shaped her into someone unyielding. Though she sometimes still cried quietly at night, she knew deep down that she had chosen the harder, braver path. And with every passing day, as Lily grew and flourished, Sarah's conviction only deepened: she had been right all along. This child had not ruined her life. She had saved it. For years passed in a blur of exhaustion, sacrifice, and fleeting moments of joy that made every struggle worth it. Sarah learned quickly that motherhood was a relentless rhythm of sleepless nights, endless responsibilities, and choices that demanded more than she thought she could give, but she never allowed herself to falter for long because Lily was always watching her. The small apartment they lived in was far from the luxury Sarah had once known, but within its walls there was laughter, the smell of homemade soup simmering on the stove, and the sound of Lily's giggles bouncing off the faded wallpaper. What it lacked in elegance, it held in warmth, and Sarah clung to that as if it were the foundation of her new identity. Life was never easy. Sarah worked long shifts at the diner, balancing trays with aching arms, plastering on a smile for customers even when her body screamed for rest. Some nights she took cleaning jobs in offices after hours, pushing a mop while her eyelids drooped. When she came home, she often collapsed on the couch with Lily curled on her chest, the two of them falling asleep together beneath a thin blanket. Money was always scarce, and there were days when Sarah skipped meals so that Lily could have enough, but she never let her daughter see her hunger. Instead, she filled Lily's world with stories. At night she told fairy tales, often making up her own, weaving worlds where brave little girls overcame dragons, storms, and darkness. Sometimes Sarah wondered if she was really telling Lily those stories or if she was whispering them to herself to believe she could survive her own battles. Lily grew quickly, her dark hair tumbling in waves down her back, her piercing blue eyes always wide with curiosity. She had her father's eyes, and sometimes Sarah's heart clenched painfully when she looked into them, but they were softened by Lily's innocence, untarnished by pride or cruelty. She was talkative, full of questions about the world, and her laughter could transform even the hardest days into something bearable. Strangers often stopped Sarah to comment on her daughter's beauty, noting how unusual her eyes were, and though the compliment stung because of the reminder of Michael, Sarah always smiled and thanked them, clutching Lily's hand a little tighter. As the years passed, Lily became Sarah's anchor. When Sarah felt like breaking, when bills threatened to drown her or her body ached from exhaustion, she found her strength in the way Lily ran into her arms after preschool or how she whispered, "I love you, Mommy," before falling asleep. Every milestone became a victory: the first time Lily took a step across the creaky floor of their apartment, the first time she said a full sentence with her soft, sweet voice, the first time she came home with a drawing she made just for Sarah, full of uneven shapes and bright colors that she called "Our Family." Each moment reminded Sarah why she had chosen this path, why she had endured. Yet shadows lingered. There were nights when Sarah cried quietly after Lily had gone to sleep, her face buried in a pillow so no one could hear. She still remembered the sting of Michael's words, the way he had looked at her as if love and family were nothing but burdens. Sometimes she wondered what life would be like if he had stayed, if Lily had known the sound of his laugh or the comfort of his embrace. Other times she grew angry, furious that he had chosen to walk away while she bore the weight of everything alone. Still, she refused to let bitterness define her. She promised herself she would never speak of him with hatred in front of Lily. If questions came one day, she would answer with honesty but not poison. Despite the hardships, Sarah created a life filled with love. She decorated their tiny apartment with thrift store finds, brightening the space with second-hand curtains and little plants she nurtured on the windowsill. On Lily's birthdays, she worked extra hours to afford a cake, even if small, and wrapped toys she saved for months to buy. The sight of Lily's eyes lighting up as she blew out candles was enough to erase the fatigue from Sarah's body. Neighbors often remarked that the bond between mother and daughter was extraordinary, almost unbreakable, and Sarah knew it was true. They were each other's world, each other's reason for surviving. For years after that night when Michael slammed the door, Sarah no longer recognized the woman she once had been. She had been naive then, dependent on promises that crumbled. Now she was fierce, resilient, someone who had fought for every piece of stability they had. The scars of abandonment still lived inside her, but they had also shaped her into a woman who could endure storms without breaking. Every time she looked at Lily, her bright, beautiful daughter with eyes like blue fire, she knew she had chosen correctly. The child Michael had called a ruin had instead become salvation, transforming Sarah's world into something far richer than any fortune he could offer. But deep down, beneath her strength, a part of Sarah knew that one day their paths would cross again. She didn't know when or how, but she felt it lingering on the horizon like a storm waiting to break. And when that day came, she swore she would face Michael not as the frightened woman he had abandoned, but as someone who had survived, endured, and risen stronger than he could ever have imagined. It was on a bitter winter afternoon, 4 years after Michael had slammed the door, that fate decided to unravel the fragile distance Sarah had built. The city was alive with people rushing in and out of shops, their breath curling in the cold air, the streets glittering with holiday lights strung above. Sarah clutched Lily's hand tightly as they stepped into the warm glow of a bookstore nestled in the corner of a bustling shopping district. The air smelled faintly of paper and cinnamon, and Lily's laughter bubbled up as she tugged her mother toward the children's section, eager to find another story to add to their nightly rituals. To Sarah, it was just another ordinary errand, another small moment of normalcy in the life she had built. She could not have known that destiny was waiting between the shelves. Michael had not intended to be there. His schedule had been packed with meetings, lunches with investors, and endless documents that demanded his signature. The years had not softened him, they had only sharpened his edges, chiseling his jawline with stress, tempering his presence with power. His dark hair had a few threads of silver now, but his blue eyes remained piercing, capable of unsettling even the most seasoned executives. That afternoon, he had ducked into the bookstore simply to escape a crowd of photographers outside, seeking a rare moment of quiet. Yet when he looked up from the aisle where he idly scanned titles, his entire world stopped. Across the room, framed by the soft glow of holiday lights, stood Sarah. She hadn't seen him yet. She was bent slightly, helping a little girl with dark hair reach a book on the lower shelf. The child turned her face upward, blue eyes flashing with a brightness that hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He froze, every thought silenced, as recognition spread through him like fire. Those eyes were his. His pulse roared in his ears. He stumbled back a step, one hand gripping the shelf as if it could anchor him in place. For years collapsed in an instant, and all he could see was the woman he had driven away and the child who was undeniably his own. Sarah's hair was longer now, her frame thinner than he remembered, her eyes lined with exhaustion and strength. She looked different, but no less beautiful. And the girl, Lily, though he did not yet know her name, was the perfect blend of both of them, a living embodiment of everything he had lost and everything he had feared. Sarah sensed the weight of his stare before she saw him. Straightening, she turned, and when her gaze collided with his, the breath caught in her throat. For a long moment neither moved, the noise of the bookstore fading into a muffled hum around them. Michael's expression was a war of disbelief, regret, and awe, while Sarah's hardened instantly, her protective instincts flaring. Her hand closed tightly around Lily's as if to shield her from a man who had once dismissed her existence as a threat. Michael's lips parted, his voice hoarse and unsteady when he finally managed to speak. Sarah. Her name cracked in the air like fragile glass. He glanced down at Lily, his jaw tightening as the truth slammed into him with undeniable force. She's mine. It wasn't a question, it was a revelation, an admission of guilt and realization all at once. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her chest rising and falling sharply as old wounds tore open. She pulled Lily close, her body a shield between her daughter and the man who had once rejected her. You don't get to say that, she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. You made your choice. You turned your back when it mattered most. Don't you dare stand here and claim her now. Michael's heart pounded violently as her words hit him harder than any boardroom defeat. He stepped forward instinctively, then stopped when he saw Sarah's glare sharpen. His blue eyes softened, filling with something she had never seen in them before, desperation. I was wrong, he whispered, his voice low, raw. God, Sarah, I was so wrong. Lily blinked between them, sensing the tension though she did not understand its depth. Tugging at her mother's sleeve, she asked innocently, Mama, who is that man? The sound of her small voice nearly broke Sarah. She knelt quickly, brushing her hand over her daughter's hair, whispering, just someone we used to know, sweetheart. She avoided Michael's gaze as she said it, but she felt his pain like a palpable weight pressing against her. For Michael, the moment was unbearable. The daughter he had denied, the woman he had driven away, were both standing before him, real and alive, and he realized he had not just lost years, he had lost pieces of himself. He longed to reach out, to touch Lily's cheek, to beg Sarah for even a shred of forgiveness, but the walls Sarah had built around herself were high and unyielding. The air between them was thick with the unspoken truth. One decision had shattered everything, and there was no easy way to put it back together. Sarah rose, her eyes burning with unshed tears, her voice cold but steady. Stay away from us. She turned, guiding Lily toward the door, every step heavy with the force of her anger and pain. Michael stood frozen in place, his body rigid, his soul unraveling as he watched them walk away. For the first time in his life, the empire he had sacrificed everything for felt meaningless, because no amount of wealth could buy back what he had thrown away with his own hands. When the door closed behind them and the winter air rushed in, Michael realized that his life had reached a crossroads. He could continue down the path he had chosen, alone and hollow, or he could fight for the woman he had lost, the child he had denied, and the family he had been too blind to see. And for the first time in years, Michael Hale knew exactly what he wanted, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built to earn it. Michael could not sleep that night after seeing Sarah and the child who was so clearly his. The vision of her small hand gripping Sarah's, her bright blue eyes glancing up with innocence and curiosity, haunted him like a wound that would not close. For years he had convinced himself he had done the right thing, that walking away had preserved his empire, his freedom, his life as he knew it. Yet in that single moment in the bookstore, all of those justifications collapsed. He realized with brutal clarity that what he had preserved was nothing compared to what he had lost. The silence of his penthouse apartment pressed down on him until he could no longer bear it, and by morning he found himself driving through the city with no destination except the one place he swore he would never return. When Sarah opened the door of her modest apartment later that week, she froze at the sight of him standing in the hallway. Michael looked different from the man she remembered. His tailored suit was immaculate, but there was something unsettled in the way he carried himself, as if he had lost the polished confidence that once defined him. His blue eyes were tired, shadowed by something deeper than sleepless nights. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the years of silence stretching between them like a canyon. Finally Sarah's voice cut through the tension, sharp and brittle. "What are you doing here?" "I had to see you," Michael said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual authority. He hesitated before adding, "I had to see her." The words ignited her anger instantly. She stepped into the doorway, blocking his view of the apartment, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You don't get to say that," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "You forfeited every right to her when you turned your back on us. When you told me she would ruin your life. You don't just show up 4 years later and decide you've changed your mind." Michael flinched at the venom in her words, but he did not retreat. "I know what I said," he admitted, his voice trembling with the weight of shame. "And I have thought about it every day since. I thought I was protecting myself, protecting everything I had built, but I was a coward. I was blind. I told myself I didn't want this, didn't need this, but when I saw her. Sarah, she's mine. She's ours. And I can't ignore that anymore." Sarah laughed bitterly, the sound laced with pain. "Now you decide you can't ignore it? Where were you when I worked double shifts just to put food on the table? Where were you when she cried through the night with fevers and I sat there praying she would pull through because I didn't even have the money for proper medicine? Where were you when I skipped meals so she wouldn't go hungry? You weren't there, Michael. I was." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, her body trembling with fury. "You want to feel guilty now? Fine. But don't you dare think guilt is enough to make you a father." Her words hit him like blows, each one a vivid reminder of everything he had abandoned. Michael stepped forward, his voice urgent, desperate. "I can't change what I did. I can't give back the years I stole from both of you. But I can give you the rest of mine. Let me prove to you that I'm not the man who left. Let me be here now, for her, for you. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to trust me. But please, don't shut me out completely." Sarah shook her head, her arms tightening around herself as if to hold in the storm raging inside her. "Do you think it's that simple? That you can just walk in here and say you've changed, and I'm supposed to hand over the child I raised alone to the man who wanted nothing to do with her? You don't understand, Michael. She doesn't know who you are. To her, you're a stranger. And I won't let you hurt her the way you hurt me." Michael's composure crumbled then, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her rejection. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, one he had carried for years though he had never admitted it to anyone. It was a picture of Sarah from before everything fell apart, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life. He held it out to her, his voice breaking. "I never stopped loving you. I never stopped thinking about what we could have had. I told myself I didn't want this, but the truth is, I was terrified. I thought a child would take everything from me, but the moment I saw her, I realized she was everything I'd been missing." Sarah stared at the photograph, her throat tightening painfully. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to protect herself and Lily from the risk of reopening wounds. But another part, the part that had once loved him deeply, felt the sincerity in his words, saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, and recognized the man who was no longer untouchable. She turned her face away, blinking back tears, unwilling to let him see the war inside her. "You don't get to walk back in like nothing happened," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "If you want to be in her life, you'll have to earn it. You'll have to prove it every single day. Not with money, not with promises, but with actions. And if you ever hurt her, Michael, I swear I'll never forgive you." Michael nodded, his expression solemn, his blue eyes glistening. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving it," he said, and in that moment, Sarah believed he meant it. Behind her, Lily's small voice drifted from the living room. "Mama, who's at the door?" Sarah turned quickly, her heart pounding, and for a moment she considered sending him away again. But when she looked back at Michael, she saw something she had never seen before, not arrogance, not pride, but a desperate, quiet humility. She stepped aside just enough for him to glimpse the little girl who would forever bind them together. And as Michael's breath caught at the sight of her, Sarah realized that no matter how hard she tried to keep the past buried, their story was far from over. Michael did not disappear after that night. In the past, his apologies had always come wrapped in expensive gifts or hollow promises, but this time there were no flowers, no jewelry, no attempts to buy forgiveness. Instead, he began showing up in the simplest of ways, ways that unsettled Sarah because she had not expected him to keep his word. The next morning, when she walked Lily to preschool before her shift at the diner, he was there on the sidewalk, his coat collar turned up against the cold, waiting with a nervous look in his eyes. He offered to walk with them, not forcing conversation, simply matching their pace as Lily chattered about her favorite book. Sarah kept her guard high, answering him with clipped sentences, but she noticed how he bent down to listen carefully to Lily, how his expression softened when she tugged on his sleeve to point out a dog in a passing window. At first Sarah thought it was a one-time gesture, but then he returned again the following week. He began meeting them on mornings when he could, sometimes carrying Lily's small backpack on his shoulder, other times holding her hand as they crossed busy streets. It startled Sarah to see how quickly Lily accepted him. Children were quick to sense sincerity, and though she didn't know the history, she recognized something safe in him, something steady. Sarah's heart clenched every time Lily ran to him with excitement, because she knew that with every bond formed, the risk of heartbreak grew greater if Michael faltered. Over the weeks, his presence seeped into the fabric of their lives. On evenings when Sarah came home exhausted from her shift, she sometimes found Michael sitting cross-legged on the floor of the apartment, surrounded by crayons and paper as Lily explained her latest drawing. He looked so out of place in the cramped, worn room, a man accustomed to marble floors and glass towers reduced to a paint-smeared shirt and hands covered in glitter, and yet he never once seemed uncomfortable. Instead, he looked at Lily as though she were the most important deal he had ever signed, the one investment he refused to lose. Sarah tried to resist the pull of those moments. She told herself he was doing this out of guilt, that he would tire of it eventually, that men like him were not capable of lasting change. But her resolve cracked in small ways she tried not to notice. She saw how he sat up half the night at her kitchen table, practicing how to read Lily's favorite storybook aloud until he could give each character a voice that made her laugh. She saw how he carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs without complaint, his once perfectly polished shoes scuffed from trudging through the city for them. She saw how he listened, not interrupting, not defending himself, when she unleashed years of resentment, confessing how terrified she had been when bills piled up and how abandoned she had felt during nights spent holding a feverish child alone. Michael never once tried to excuse himself. He never said he had suffered too, never tried to balance the scales by reminding her of what he had lost. Instead, he absorbed every word like punishment he deserved, nodding quietly, sometimes closing his eyes as though the weight of her pain pressed down on him until he could hardly breathe. Yet he remained, day after day, never fleeing from the storm of her anger or the sharp edge of her mistrust. One evening, when Lily had fallen asleep curled on the couch with a book clutched to her chest, Sarah found herself standing in the doorway, watching Michael as he carefully tucked a blanket around her. The sight stirred something deep inside her, something dangerous, because it reminded her of the man she had once loved before pride and fear had destroyed them. When he looked up and caught her gaze, his expression was raw, unguarded. "I don't deserve this chance," he whispered, "but I'll fight every day to earn it." She didn't respond, but her silence was no longer as sharp as it once had been. Still, trust did not return easily. Sarah lay awake many nights, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling the same questions. Could people truly change? Was Michael's devotion permanent or temporary? Would he still be here in a year, or would Lily be left with the same emptiness Sarah had endured? Fear gnawed at her constantly, because her daughter's heart was not something she could afford to gamble with. And yet, beneath the fear, a fragile flicker of hope burned. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't deny it. Michael began withdrawing slowly from the world he had once worshipped. Board meetings were missed, deals were postponed, and colleagues muttered about his lack of focus. For the first time in his career, he didn't care. He had spent years chasing wealth and influence, but now he found himself caring more about whether Lily finished her school project than whether his company's quarterly numbers impressed investors. His priorities shifted quietly, but the change was unmistakable. As spring crept into the city, Sarah noticed subtle differences in him. He laughed more, his laughter genuine rather than forced. He carried himself differently, not with the rigid arrogance she remembered, but with humility, as though he had finally understood the fragility of life and the importance of what he had nearly lost. When neighbors saw him carrying Lily on his shoulders or kneeling to tie her shoelaces, they assumed he had always been there, a father simply doing what fathers do. Only Sarah knew the truth, that this was not a man who had been born ready for fatherhood, but one who had clawed his way toward it with desperation and regret. The walls Sarah had built did not crumble overnight, but cracks began to appear. One evening, after another long day at work, she returned home to find the apartment spotless, the dishes washed, and Lily sitting proudly at the table with a homemade meal Michael had cooked. The food was unevenly seasoned, the rice overcooked, but the effort stole her breath. Lily beamed, announcing, "Daddy made dinner," and Sarah had to turn away quickly so no one could see the tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in 4 years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what life could be if she let the past go. It was a fragile vision, dangerous to believe in, but it was there nonetheless, pressing against the edges of her heart. She still did not trust him fully, still kept her guard raised, but she could not deny the truth anymore. Michael was changing. And whether she wanted it or not, part of her was beginning to change with him. The fragile routine that had begun to form around their lives shattered one cold evening when Sarah least expected it. She and Lily had just left the diner where Sarah had been covering a late shift, the air heavy with the scent of fried food clinging to her uniform, when she noticed a car idling at the corner of the street. At first she dismissed it, thinking it was someone waiting to pick up a friend, but when she turned down the narrow alley toward her apartment, the car moved slowly after them. A chill of unease slid down her spine. She gripped Lily's small hand more tightly and quickened her pace, but the sound of footsteps crunching against gravel told her they were no longer alone. 2 men stepped out from the shadows, their heavy coats pulled tight against the cold, their eyes sharp and predatory. Sarah froze, her heart racing, her instinct screaming to protect her daughter. One of them spoke her name, his voice rough and unfamiliar, and she pulled Lily closer against her side. He told her they knew who she was, that she was connected to Michael Hale, and that Michael had left behind unfinished business that others intended to collect. The word sent ice through her veins. She had tried so hard to keep her life simple, to stay far away from Michael's world of power and enemies, yet here it was, spilling into her fragile existence. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the night, low and furious. Michael emerged from the darkness at the far end of the alley, his shoulders squared, his eyes blazing with something Sarah had never seen in him before. He moved quickly, positioning himself between Sarah and the men, his tall frame forming a wall of protection. The arrogance that once defined him was gone. In its place was something raw, primal, a man prepared to defend what he had nearly lost. He told the men to leave, his voice a command that held no room for argument, but they only smirked, muttering that they weren't leaving without what was owed. One of them lunged forward, and in that instant Michael attacked without hesitation. Sarah had seen him fight for business deals, had seen him cut down competitors with words, but she had never seen him like this. He was not fighting for pride or power, he was fighting for his family. His fists connected with the man's jaw, the sound sharp in the cold air, while the other rushed him from behind. Michael staggered but held his ground, his breath harsh, his movements fueled by years of buried rage and desperation. Sarah clutched Lily against her chest, her own breath ragged, as she watched the man who had once walked away from them now fight as though his life depended on protecting them. The struggle was brief but brutal. Blood stained Michael's lip, his knuckles raw, but he did not relent until the men backed away, retreating with threats muttered under their breath as they stumbled back toward their car. The sound of the engine roared as they sped off, leaving behind only the echo of violence and the heavy sound of Michael's breathing. He turned back to Sarah then, his chest heaving, his eyes softening when they landed on her and Lily pressed together in the shadows. For a moment Sarah could not move, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. Michael dropped to his knees in front of Lily, pulling her gently into his arms. His voice was hoarse, broken, as he whispered over and over that she was safe, that no one would ever hurt her, not while he was alive to stop it. Lily, wide-eyed and shaken, clung to his neck with surprising trust, burying her face into his shoulder. Sarah stood frozen, watching the scene with tears blurring her vision. It was in that moment, seeing Michael bruised and bloodied but holding their daughter with such fierce tenderness, that she realized something inside him truly had shifted. He was no longer the man who had shouted that a child would ruin his life, he was a man who had just risked his life to protect her. Later that night, after they had calmed Lily and put her to bed, Sarah confronted him in the small kitchen of her apartment. Her voice shook with equal parts fury and fear as she demanded to know what kind of world he had dragged into their lives, whether this danger was only the beginning. Michael didn't try to defend himself with excuses. He admitted the truth, that his success had come with enemies, that he had burned bridges and left wounds that others wanted to exploit. But then he told her that he had already begun severing ties, that he was willing to walk away from every deal, every empire, every dollar he had built if it meant keeping Sarah and Lily safe. His words carried none of the arrogance she remembered, instead, they were heavy with desperation and sincerity. "I can rebuild a company," he told her, his eyes locked on hers. "I can earn back money, status, whatever I need. But I can't rebuild her. I can't rebuild you. I won't risk either of you for anything in this world." Sarah's heart twisted painfully at the confession, because for the first time she believed him. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in the way his voice cracked. This wasn't about guilt anymore. This was about love, fierce and undeniable. She wanted to cling to her anger, to remind herself of the nights she had cried alone, of the years she had carried the burden without him. But as she looked at him standing there, blood still drying at the corner of his mouth, his hands trembling from the fight, she knew he had proven something no apology ever could. He had chosen them. He had fought for them with everything he had. That night Sarah did not let him hold her, and she did not offer forgiveness. But she did not send him away either. Instead, as he sat quietly on the floor outside Lily's room, keeping watch while she slept, Sarah allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope. It scared her more than anything, because hope had betrayed her before. Yet in the silence of the night, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this time it would be different. Months passed after the night of the alley confrontation, and though fear lingered in Sarah's chest, life slowly began to settle into a rhythm she had never imagined possible. Michael kept his word in ways that startled her. He pulled himself away from the ruthless pace of his company, handing responsibilities to others and stepping down from meetings that once consumed his days. His board of directors fought him, warning him that he was risking everything he had built, but for the first time in his life he didn't flinch at the threat of losing it all. To Michael, the empire he had protected so fiercely seemed hollow compared to the laughter of his daughter echoing in a cramped apartment kitchen, or the small smile Sarah tried to hide when she realized she didn't have to carry everything on her shoulders anymore. He had spent years chasing power only to discover that true strength lay in being present for the people who needed him. Sarah, however, did not surrender her trust easily. Though she could see his sincerity, the scars of his abandonment cut deep, and she guarded her heart like a fortress. She let him into their daily life slowly, allowing him to take Lily to school, to help with homework, to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom, to cook clumsy dinners that often ended in laughter. With every act of consistency, every small sacrifice, her resolve weakened a little more. She had expected him to tire of the effort, to drift back into the world of wealth and distraction, but instead he leaned further in. When she faltered, he was there. When bills arrived, he paid them quietly without boasting. When she came home exhausted, he had already washed the dishes and tucked Lily into bed. His devotion did not feel like a performance, it felt like repentance carved into every detail of their lives. One spring afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting on the park bench while Michael and Lily played together in the grass. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and children's voices carried through the warm breeze. Michael, dressed not in a suit but in a plain shirt and jeans, chased Lily with exaggerated slowness, letting her squeal with delight as she darted away from his reaching arms. He scooped her up at last, spinning her until she collapsed into laughter, her blue eyes sparkling with pure joy. Sarah watched the scene with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. For years she had convinced herself that she didn't need him, that Lily didn't need him, but seeing them together made her realize how wrong she had been. The little girl had been missing something she could never have given her alone, and Sarah could not deny that Michael had become more of a father in the past months than she had ever dared hope he would. That evening, as they walked home beneath the golden glow of street lamps, Michael broke the silence with a voice quieter than usual. He told her he wanted to leave everything behind, the company, the relentless world of power, and start again. Not in the grand penthouse that had once been his fortress, but somewhere smaller, quieter, somewhere they could be a family. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with disbelief. She accused him of being impulsive, of not understanding what that meant, but he only shook his head and looked at her with a seriousness that made her chest tighten. "I've lived my life chasing numbers on a screen, applause from people who don't care if I live or die," he said. "But when I hear Lily call me daddy, when I see you smile even for a second, I feel something I never felt in any of those boardrooms. That's what I want. That's what I can't lose again." Sarah wanted to argue, to protect herself from the hope swelling in her chest, but the truth in his words was undeniable. For the first time, she saw not the ruthless businessman who had once turned his back, but a man stripped bare, vulnerable, willing to give up everything to earn what he once threw away. The walls she had built began to crack for good that night, though she still held on to a shred of caution, because she had learned the cost of believing too easily. The final test came when Michael asked her to let him move in with them. Sarah hesitated for weeks, torn between fear and the undeniable change she had seen in him. But then one night, when Lily fell ill with a fever, Michael stayed awake by her bedside, pressing cool cloths to her forehead and whispering stories until dawn. Sarah, sitting in the doorway, watched him with tears streaming down her face. In that moment, she realized she was no longer fighting for the past, she was fighting against a future that was already unfolding before her eyes. She finally whispered, her voice breaking, "Stay." Michael looked up at her with a raw expression, as if her single word had shattered years of guilt and longing. He nodded silently, his hand never leaving Lily's as she drifted in and out of restless sleep. From that night on, he did not leave. He became a fixture in their home, not a guest, not an outsider, but a partner. The small apartment that had once felt like a place of survival transformed into something alive with possibility. Months later, in the quiet of a mountain lodge they had rented for the winter, Michael asked Sarah to marry him. He did not kneel in front of a crowd or present a grand spectacle. Instead, he waited until Lily had fallen asleep in the next room, until the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and then he placed a simple ring in Sarah's hand. He told her he didn't want to bind her with promises of wealth or status, but with the vow to never leave again, to stand beside her in every storm. Sarah cried as she listened, her heart finally surrendering to the truth she could no longer deny: he had changed. The man who once shouted that their child would ruin him had discovered that she had, in fact, saved him. The wedding was not lavish, just a small gathering of people who mattered, but to Sarah it was perfect. Lily twirled in a white dress, her laughter filling the air as Michael bent down to kiss her forehead, whispering that she was the most beautiful flower girl he had ever seen. When Sarah looked at him across the vows they exchanged, she realized that forgiveness had not been a single moment but 1,000 small ones, woven together by persistence, humility, and love. As the years moved forward, their life was far from flawless. There were still arguments, still scars that surfaced at unexpected times, still shadows of the past that threatened to darken their present. But they faced it all together, bound by the fight they had endured and the family they had become. And though Sarah never forgot the pain of the night he walked away, she carried with her the memory of the man who returned, not with excuses, but with his heart, unguarded and willing. In the end, the story that had once begun with rejection and despair transformed into something Sarah never thought possible. It became the story of redemption, of second chances, of love that had been shattered and rebuilt stronger than before. And as she watched Michael holding their daughter's hand on a snowy path years later, his blue eyes full of warmth and devotion, she understood that sometimes the most painful endings were only the beginning of the most extraordinary journeys.